Hi everyone, Heather Liu from Closet Core Patterns here, coming to you to talk to you about a very exciting topic, which is how to buy a dress form if you're sewing your own clothes. So as you can see, we're kind of experts on dress forms here in the studio. We've tried all of them, all the different kinds, and I actually just wrote a really long, involved blog post over on the Closet Core blog where I give you links to lots of these different companies. So either you can check in the description of the video or you can head over to that blog post if you want a little bit more information. But basically, I just want to break down all the different kinds for you because I know that this is a really overwhelming purchase the first time. Dress forms tend to be pretty expensive, and you might be wondering whether or not you even need one for your sewing practice. So I'm going to try to walk through all this stuff and hopefully make making this decision a little bit easier. First up, what's a dress form? Well, when you think of a dress form, you might think of something like this. Okay, so this is a vintage dress form, very classic. It's got that muslin fabric, it's got the metal cage, it's on this little wheelie thing, and so this is generally what you probably have in mind when you think of dress forms. And traditionally, what dress forms are used for is fitting, obviously, but this is I don't know whose body this is a representation of, but there's probably very few people who have these exact proportions. So I think one of the biggest questions people have when they're buying a dress form is, well, my body is a certain shape and I'm unlikely to be able to find one that's the exact representation, so what do I do? There's some ways we can get around that, but just first and foremost, in terms of what you're going to use it for, on a very base level, if you're sewing really simple, like things like hemming a dress, so often when you make a skirt, if it's cut on the bias at all, that skirt needs to settle, and then you come back to it a day or two later after the hem is kind of relaxed into its final shape. And having a dress form in that case is so easy because once you put the skirt on the dress form, you can go and take your ruler and go all the way around, get a nice even hem, cut it where it needs to be. If you're doing any fine like hand sewing, often it's really helpful to have a dress form just to have a kind of body shape that you can work on while you're maybe doing some applique or other different sewing tasks. But I think maybe the one that is most commonly used, especially with a standard form like this, is actually pattern making. So whether or not you're drafting by hand, you're drafting by computer, or you're draping, and draping is when you're taking pieces of fabric and you're actually molding them on the dress form and you're actually building the pattern on this form. These are, if you're a pattern designer at all, if you're a designer of dress forms, are indispensable because it gives you a three-dimensional body shape to actually test and see what your garment's going to look like in the final draft. So if you're interested in pattern making at all, I highly suggest getting one. If you're thinking about getting into the either sewing business or fashion business, you need a dress form if you're doing any kind of pattern drafting because you need a consistent size and a consistent body shape to try your drafts on. So for me, for us, for example, at Closet Core, behind me I have the two dress forms that we use. For us to have consistent results and to understand how a garment's going to fit every time, we want to have the same dress form. So you don't necessarily want to use yourself as a fit model, because your body is unique and isn't maybe a standard shape, and maybe you're putting, your size is changing over time. And so you really want to have something consistent that doesn't change, that is the exact same thing. So when you're drafting a dress or a skirt or a top, you can kind of come to expect what it's supposed to look like on your dress form. Of course, in that case, you need to have a consistent size that you're drafting for, so you would want whatever that consistent size is. If it's a 6 or an 8 or a 10 or a 15 or a 16 and you're drafting up and down, you're grading up and down in different sizes, you need to have a consistent size that you're using for that. And so it depends on what your size chart is and what industry you're in, what that standard size is. But for us, we have two dress forms that we use in each of our different size ranges because we have a 0 to 20 range and we have a 14 to 32. And it just ensures that when we go to try on the drafted pattern, we know how it's supposed to hang on this dress form. And so it just gives us a good standard to look at, and it's a good baseline, essentially. But if you're just sewing for fun, that becomes a little less relevant. Really, you want a dress form that best reflects the shape of your body. And so obviously if you're buying a commercial form like this comes, there isn't much that you can do to this to change it. This is a rigid form, it's metal underneath, it's got fabric. But what you can do is you can buy a form that is as close as possible to your natural measurements. So maybe you want to choose something that's, maybe it's really important that you get something that's close as possible to your upper body, so you maybe find something that's got a similar bust measurement or shoulder measurement or waist measurement. And then you can pad out the form. So when in doubt, go a little bit smaller. Always, if you're ever in doubt, always go a little bit smaller with your form, because you can make a form bigger, but you can't make it smaller. So again, if you visit the blog post, we have all sorts of instructions about how to pad it out. But you can literally just take like quilt batting and shoulder pads, and you can pad out the form so that maybe you need the hips to be a little bit bigger. Maybe this rib cage is similar to yours, but you need bigger breasts, so you could maybe put a bra on it and stuff it with shoulder pads so that you get that bust. So there are ways to take a standard form and then to make it fit you. So don't feel like, oh, I have X, Y, and Z, and I'm never going to be able to find anything that is exact representation. You won't, but you can make one that fits. So kind of talked a little bit about what a dress form is, what you should use it for, but let's talk a little bit about the different types of dress forms, because there's lots of different options on the market, especially these days, and it can feel a little bit overwhelming when you're trying to figure out which one do I go for. So the first one that the most common one and maybe the more expensive one are commercial or industry grade dress forms. So those are what we use in the studio. And I think at one point this probably was an industry grade dress form. It's a vintage model, it's a little bit older. But if you're looking at a company like Wolf, for example, an old school dress company, I think they're based out of New York, this is kind of what those Wolf form looks like with the cage. And if you were a dressmaker or a tailor back in the day, this is the kind of thing that you were probably working from. But obviously with technology and data, things have changed quite a bit. And now we have companies like Alvinon, who is the company that makes the dress forms that we use here in the studio. And what I love about Alvinon is that they are a really data-driven company, and so they are constantly doing surveys. They are looking at body morphic data all of the time. And the dress forms that they create are based on basically actual averages of the average person. So they go and do all of these, take all of these measurements, they do all of these studies, they're doing 3D scans of people's bodies. And then based on that data, they're able to kind of find averages, because believe it or not, bodies actually change over time. The average body shape in the 50s, for example, was different than what our bodies are shaped like now. So it's great if you're working with a company that is looking at all of that data all of the time and is constantly adjusting, because it means that even if it's a fixed body shape and it's a fixed form, you can kind of count on it, well, this is actually based, these dress forms, they have slightly rounded shoulders because this company knows that we're at computers all day long. So just simple things like that you wouldn't necessarily think of, you're gonna see basically the way that bodies transform reflected in these forms. And the other thing I love about Alvinon is that they have dozens of models. So they have models for regions, right? So they have dress form models for the North American market, the European market, the Asian market, because bodies do change sometimes depending on what region you are in the world. The other thing I love is that they have different body shapes. So this is from their Missy Straight series. This is a size 8. This is the size that we use as a base model for the closet core pattern range. And it's a straight model, so it's got a B-cup base, which means there's about 2 inches of difference between the full bust and the high bust. And then it's got a waist, and then the hip it's curvy, but it's fairly straight. Like, it's not an hourglass shape, it's not a pear shaped, it's kind of a pretty proportionate body shape. So this is what we use for our 0 to 20. But then when we get into our 14 to 30, our plus size range, we did a lot of internal data, and we realized that people in that size range tend to be a little bit more pear-shaped and tend to have bigger busts, more of a D cup. So when we went to choose what our base size was going to be, we picked a dress form from the plus curvy range, and this is the size 18. And as you can see, kind of proportionately, the hips are a little bit wider proportionately than they are with this range. The bust is a little bit wider. So it allows us to ensure that we're drafting our patterns for the kind of the average body shape, that we have a really good proportionate kind of example of that. And then when we go to draft those patterns, we know how these are supposed to fit on each form. And the longer that you work with them, it becomes much more intuitive. You can kind of look at something immediately and be like, that doesn't look right. And it's much easier to do that when you're objectively looking at a dress form than when you're looking at a garment on your body. Because sometimes we go and put a garment on our body, and we look in the mirror, and we have all sorts of body hang-ups and all sorts of stuff. We're not necessarily maybe we're looking at a garment and we're not objectively looking at the garment, we're actually looking at our body and how we look in the mirror. And when you're working with clothes and you're sewing, it's better always to try to be as objective as possible. So it's great to put something on a form because, again, you just get a better sense. So the Alvinon forms, I don't want to, this is not a paid post. We're not being sponsored by Alvinon. We're just really big fans. But I will say that a form like this, they're very expensive. I think we bought these, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, but I think at the time they're about $2,500 US, and then they're made to order, and then you have to pay for customs and shipping. So I think all in, these both ended up costing over $4,000 US to get them in the studio. That said, you can often find them on Etsy, so if you wanted, or secondhand, so if you wanted to set up a Google notification or something like that on Etsy, you might be able to find, or sorry, on eBay, you might end up being able to find a secondhand one that's not going to set you back as much. But the other beautiful thing about a professional form is it has all sorts of features. So this form, for example, one of my favorite things, again, it's a rigid form, it's covered in canvas, but it has a squishy tummy. So if we're doing up a pair of tight jeans or leggings or something like that, you know, when you put on a pair of tight fitting jeans, sometimes you're kind of relying on the softness of your body. And if you have a really rigid dress form, that can be hard to do the pants up. So we really love this feature, this little squishy body. Alvinon also has like fully squishy models, especially if you're designing lingerie, for example, bras and things like that. You really need to have like soft breast tissue, and you need to have soft body parts so that you can see how those garments fit. So that's also an option. The other wonderful thing about these is they have collapsible shoulders. So you can push the shoulder in like this, and it should lock. Is it going to lock for me? So if you're having to take a garment on or off, these shoulders collapse, so it's easier to get it on and or off, because obviously it's not like a human body where you can manipulate all the joints. The other thing it has is removable arms. So these arms come off, and then there's also, it comes with this cap sleeve option that just slide on like that. So if you're trying on maybe, if you're drafting or you're working on a dress like a tank top or something like that, and you don't need a full arm, this is also a nice option, and then it's just even easier to get the garment on and off. Other things we like about this, it's fully pinnable, so our pattern drafter Celine can come and stick pins in here. And then we have all of the key markings kind of noted on the form. So we've got the bust point, we've got our waist point, we've got high hip, low hip. On the back, those seam markings are here. And also, this leg comes off. We don't take it off very often, but if we needed to, this entire leg is removable as well. And so for us, this is a great form because it's got legs, so we can try pants on it. It's got all of these bust markings, it's pinnable, it's got a soft tummy, and it's based on the most kind of up-to-date body data that we have available. And also, a company like Alvinon, they also offer all of their dress forms as 3D dress forms as well. So if you're working in a 3D program like Clo 3D, which we do internally in the studio, you can also get a virtual representation of this form. So if we're doing testing, grading, for example, we can actually test this on the form virtually as well. So that's really helpful. Obviously that has a cost attached to it, but I think they offer discounts if you've already purchased forms from them. And then we also love this mobile stand. It's smooth wheels. It's got these hooks if we want to hang samples on it. And then this dress form can just come on and off quite easily if we need to take it off. So these are the Alvinon forms. I would say these are kind of like the Cadillac of dress forms. If you're just a hobby sewist, this is maybe a little bit more than you need. So what are your options? Well, there are more affordable professional level forms, like I said. So something like this, a Wolf form. There's also the Shop company. Again, if you want to visit the blog post, I link a couple other companies, and so you might, in those kind of lower end professional forms, you might expect to pay $300 to $800 again for a fabric covered rigid base, and most of the time they're going to come just with this the skirt base. They're not going to necessarily, like on a $300 or $400 price point, you're not going to be able to get detachable arms and legs and detachable shoulders, collapsible shoulders, all that stuff. It's going to end up probably being a pretty standard form, but you can get those from the Shop company for about $300 or $400. And again, they also, a lot of these companies sell padding kits, so if you want to go and pad it and get it to your shape, you can do that. The other big kind of development in dress forms, and I would say in the last 10 years, is because of 3D printing technology, it's become a lot easier to, let's say, cut things out of foam. So that's when we start having these foam forms hitting the market. This company, I believe, they sent this to us to review a few years ago. I think they have now rebranded as Royal, the Royal dress form company. And this is an entirely foam. I feel really filthy right now. I'm really filling up this dress form. But this entire thing is stretchy and soft and foam. So if you are trying on tight fitting things or you're doing lingerie or whatever, this is pretty squishy and soft. So it has that nice softness that's similar to a human body. As you can see, it's got all of our key markings. So it's got a neckline mark, it's got an upper chest, it's got a high bust, waist, hip measurement. It's got all of these vertical lines as well. These are especially helpful if you're draping. Because when you're draping, you need really consistent marks to, like if you're draping a bodice or something, you need this center front line and you need this side seam line so that you're able to properly draft those pieces. So this is already built on. Versus our Alvinon form, when Celine, our pattern maker, is drafting, sometimes she has to go and get this draping tape and put the draping tape because it's not as fully marked as this. So this includes those markings. It's on a little mobile back and forth wheelie stand here. I believe it raises and lowers. But as you can see, there's no arms on this. There's no collapsible shoulders, although it is squishy. And there's no leg. Depending on the company, sometimes they sell accessories. I believe this company does sell an arm add-on, so you can get an arm to add it on, but it doesn't include it. So you can just kind of tell this is just a bit more of a basic dress form than this one. This has more features, but this is really great as well. And as far as I know, the Royal Dress Form company that produces this does dress forms in a few different body shapes. So they have pear-shaped, they have larger busted, they have hourglass, they have more of a rectangular shape, they have an inverted triangle shape. So if you have a body shape that's maybe not like a kind of hourglassy shape, there are forms that might, or there are companies that might make dress forms that might cater to your particular body shape, which is pretty cool. One thing I will say is that unfortunately the dress form industry isn't maybe as inclusive as we would like, and so in the blog post I list the kind of max sizes that each company goes to, but Alvinon definitely has the widest size range in terms of the how far up they go on their size chart. So you might want to just go take a look at that list and see which companies like what hip size, and I think I actually put the hip size in as well, so you can see how far up the hip size goes, and maybe try to find a company that actually makes a form for your size. So sizing, this is a really good transition to talk about what to do if you just can't find a form that fits you, or you want something that's really custom to your shape, or you just maybe don't have a huge budget and want to make something that closely resembles your body. So there are all sorts of amazing, affordable DIY options, really creative ways that you can make dress forms. And one of the ways that people have been doing it is wrapping themselves, like literally with a friend, wrapping themselves in duct tape. And that duct tape, the more layers you add, actually ends up giving you a pretty good facsimile of your body. And then you take that, you cut that duct form shape off, stuff it with batting, and then mount it, and you end up having like a pretty reasonable facsimile of your body. So that can be a pretty affordable way to make a DIY form. There's different paper mache, there's all sorts of different techniques that you can make a completely custom form based on your body. Again, if you go to the blog, we have links to all of these tutorials if you'd like to learn more. The other option, if you want a completely custom form and you have the budget for it, is to actually get one custom made for your body by a company. So, custom dress form, again, this is all possible because of the amazing technological advances we have made with 3D printing and scanning. So it is possible to have a dress form made that is a 3D replica of your body. And I had this form made for me by a company called Beatrice. It's a husband and wife owned business in the US. They are wonderful, lovely people. They're active members of the sewing community, and they are really good at tech. And so they developed a system to have completely custom dress forms built for their customers. And so how this worked was they sent me a little box with all these tight-fitting garments, and there was a few little like pieces of twill tape and a few things that they needed for me to wear. And then I downloaded an app, and then somebody on the team scanned my body, just did a 360 view of my body as I was standing naturally, and I think you have to do it a couple times so they get a good average. And we sent that data off to Beatrice, and then they made this 3D replica of my body. And what was so fascinating about this is when the dress form came in, the shoulders are a little bit uneven, right? Our bodies aren't symmetrical. So this was really interesting for me to see how much lower this shoulder was. And even in the back, because this shoulder's lower, the back is a little bit fuller on the right side than it is on the left. You can see the curve of my tummy. And like, this is a very, guys, I've seen myself naked. This is what you're wondering, this is kind of what my body looks like. It was so wild when I saw this, to see a physical representation of your body that isn't your body was kind of a weird psychedelic experience. But what was great about this is that if I'm fitting a garment now, I don't even put the thing on. Like if I'm fitting dresses and things like that, I'm just fitting it on the dress form, and I know that any adjustment I make to a dart or to a seam line or whatever is going to exactly mirror my shape. And again, this form it's cut out of foam, so it's really soft, it's really mushy. And again, if I needed to put like a tight-fitting dress or something like that on here, the dress form is going to adapt to that. Obviously, something like this is more of a luxury, so they sent this to us as a test, so as a gift. So I think we didn't end up having to pay for it. I think something like this is going to run you like $1,500 plus. So it is a bit of an investment. And if your body, and especially if you're somebody whose body kind of fluctuates a lot, it might not maybe be the best option for you because if your body's changing a lot, this is obviously a fairly fixed form. That said, again, if you want to have it maybe made when you're on your smaller scale, and then as your body changes, you can always pad up your form as you need to, and then you know, like your shoulder angle is not going to change. So maybe you end up having to pad out the hips a bit, or padding out the tummy, padding out the bust. But the basic shape of the body, the length of the torso, the proportion of everything isn't going to change, and so you have that as a base model. So this is a really great option if you have the budget for it. Obviously, we were very lucky to get sent this, and I really appreciate it. Thank you, Beatrice. I think there are a few other companies that do these custom forms, but I'm a big fan of Beatrice, so if you're looking, I would just say head straight over there. Finally, so we've talked about industry level forms, we've talked about these foam forms that are starting to emerge, we've talked about a DIY form, like a duct tape form or a paper mache form, and then we've talked about custom forms. The last form out there, and unfortunately we don't have an example of it, but it's readily available at any sewing store, are the adjustable forms. So I'm sure you've seen these before. If you've ever gone into a big box store, their Singer makes a red one, can't miss it. I think Dritz makes one, and essentially the entire shape of it can be adjusted. They have these little dials, so you can turn the dial and then the entire form will grow. So the bust will get bigger, the rib cage will get bigger, the waist can get bigger, the hips can get bigger. Sometimes they have dials that will adjust the vertical length, so you can make the torso longer, the neck can get wider. I think Singer doesn't have a very inclusive form, like I think the one they sell doesn't, there's only a few handful of sizes, but I think Dritz has a wider range. I think the max that you can expand it to is a little bit wider, so that's great. But I would say for those, they're great, first of all, because they're probably the most budget-friendly option. I think you can probably get them for about $150. But I would not use those for pattern making, because as the form expands, it gets gaps in between the solid parts. And so if you're draping, like absolutely can't use it for draping. And if you're using for pattern making, I just don't know if it's the best. I would use something like that more for what we've already talked about. If you're a hobby sewer and you need something to mount your dress on while you're hemming it, or if you can actually get your measurements somewhat close and you want to use it for measurements, fine. But in terms of any kind of more involved or advanced pattern making, I wouldn't suggest it, but they are a great option. And the other thing is, I would like to encourage you to think about is you can make an investment in this, and these hold their value. So if you want to buy an adjustable form and then sell it a year later because it's not exactly what you want, they hold their value pretty well, and so you can always just sell it and try the next thing, maybe upgrade a little bit. So whether you are a sewist, a fashion designer, somebody working in the sewing industry, I hope this was helpful for you to understand all of the different types of dress forms and the different features and what you can expect to use them for. Of course, if you want more information, head over to our blog where we've got all of the links to the companies that I talked about and links to those tutorials for making your own DIY dress form. Hope you have found this helpful, and happy sewing.